was an electric atmosphere here with all of the banners and singing and chanting. A band went by a little while ago playing old marching tunes from the communist guerrilla army of the 1930s. Trucks have been whizzing by filled with people waving banners. The closest parallel that I can think of to this is people power in the Philippines in 1986. It has that same quality, an entire society turning against its rulers, but doing so in a peaceful manner. That is what is noticeable with this side.
In May of 1989, the CPC instituted martial law across the country in order to stem the tide of a deeply entrenched and increasingly militant protest movement coalescing in and around central Beijing. In early June, the standoff between protesters and soldiers came to a head, and in the ensuing chaos, many people lost their lives. In December of the same year, the US invaded the state of Panama. Panama's deeply corrupt de facto ruler, Manuel Noriega, had defied his erstwhile allies' directives, and in response, the US launched a punitive exercise in power to teach Noriega a lesson in servitude. Many Panamanian civilians lost their homes, their jobs, and their lives. There are many similarities between these two tragedies, besides both taking place in 1989. For instance, both have a wide range of conflicting death toll figures, ranging from the mid-hundreds up to the high thousands. Both have high rates of civilian casualties. Both lasted a little over a month. Both were mostly one-sided, and both were punitive responses to recalcitrant stands against overwhelming state power. And yet, only one of these events is remembered today. In 1998, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote that a propaganda system will consistently portray people abused in enemy states as worthy victims, whereas those treated with equal or greater severity by its own government or clients will be unworthy. The evidence of worth may be read from the extent and character of attention and indignation. There is a pervasive information filtering system that prescribes and formulates the quality and tenor of the news, even today. Tiananmen and Panama are textbook examples of this system at work. In what follows, I will be comparing these two events. I'll be looking at the events themselves and at the coverage then and now of both. This is a video about the media, about propaganda, about lies and distortions, and about the importance of self-reflection and the prevalence of truth. Leading human rights organisations commemorate and condemn the events of June 1989 every year, and have done more or less for the past 32 years. Amnesty International called the incident China's indelible stain in 2019, and Human Rights Watch called on the CPC to account for the massacre in an editorial from 2021. Human rights organisations do important work, and it would be wrong to attack them for their positions. However, it's important to note that while human rights groups are officially non-partisan, they nevertheless conform, probably unwittingly, to Western doctrine, as will be made clear later on. For now, let's say that human rights groups should hold governments to account for crimes committed in the past, and ignore for now the dearth of reports written about the invasion of Panama. What's important is that the Tiananmen Square incident is still clearly seared into the public consciousness. as is evidenced from the huge amount of coverage it receives to this day on and around June the 4th every year. In the past 3 years alone, there have been a large number of commemorative articles from the BBC, the Boston Globe, the Guardian, Al Jazeera, and others. And it isn't just human rights groups and the media that have an obsession with the Tiananmen Square incident, it's the US political class too. There's simply no shortage of US politicians decrying enemy state crimes.
In Tiananmen Square.
Massacre of pro-democracy protesters at Tiananmen Square.
30 years ago at Tiananmen Square, and
of the massacre in Tiananmen Square.
Impressed
about what happened in Tiananmen Square.
the courage of
It was
the
Tiananmen Square.
Now, I could believe that US politicians were simply holding China's feet to the fire as a matter of principle, knowing that the CPC won't. If it wasn't for... that. Oh, and Panama for that matter. Now look, for those of you saying that US politicians can rail against Tiananmen and their own government, I agree, in principle. And so I have less of a problem with AOC or Bernie Sanders commemorating Tiananmen, since they are both more or less consistent critics of US foreign policy too. More or less. But when you have the principal architects of US interventions crying crocodile tears for the victims of state power, well, then we have a problem. A problem that seems to extend all the way to the media and intellectual classes in the US too. Gore Vidal called the US the United States of Amnesia, for this very reason. They wring their hands shamelessly at the crimes of enemies, having willfully forgotten their own. But anyway, we're getting off track. Tiananmen. Assuming for the time being that the architects of the Gulf Wars are acting in good faith when they commemorate June 4th, something we'll come back to later, we need to remind ourselves what it is exactly that they are commemorating. First of all, and despite what the West characterised it as, the movement was not initially about democracy at all. Dingxin Zhao, discussing the climate in China in the late 1980s, wrote that, "Wherever I went, including on the bus and on street corners, people were talking about inflation, corruption, income disparities, and widespread crime." He stated further that during the late 1980s, when the Chinese economy was in a deep crisis, the living standard of intellectuals declined, and students had a hard time finding desirable jobs after graduation. Students and intellectuals were demoralized. When this aggrieved population was galvanized by campus crisis discourse after 1986, the result was frequent student protests, which culminated in 1989. You see, after Mao Zedong's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping became de facto leader of China at the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in 1978, proposing to repair the cleavages of the Cultural Revolution by launching a series of pro-market reforms. By privatizing aspects of the public sector and by opening up and deregulating the market, Deng paved the way for corruption and nepotism, as party elites picked the spoils of industry for themselves. In The Unknown Cultural Revolution, Dongpin Han writes that Deng Xiaoping's reforms turned managers of state-owned enterprises into dictators who did not need to answer to anyone, least of all the workers. In this situation, workers in some places began to sabotage the factories to protest mismanagement by their managers. He went on to write that the dissolution of the socialist collective under Deng destroyed the 5 guarantees system, which had provided food, clothing, fuel, education, and a funeral. Doubly painful, given that the rural medical system had been dismantled too. Wang Hui concludes in his book that frustration increased among various elements of the population as the decade passed and as the corruptions and abuses of the reform process revealed themselves. Rapid growth also led to increasing polarization and income inequality among urban dwellers. The combination of these sources of frustration eventually led to a national explosion of discontent in the spring of 1989 and the consequent repression. So, while pro-democracy voices came into play eventually, it's interesting to note that the protests initially began as an outpouring of frustration at Deng's pro-market reforms, not as a total repudiation of the Chinese ruling party. As a result of the reforms, inequality steadily increased from 1985 until 1989. Persistent inflation and economic disruption hindered social development. There were large influxes of rural migrants and crime increased. The protesters were angry at the rot in the system, not necessarily the system itself. In fact, despite the image of the movement we have in the West, the students themselves were invariably quite patriotic and desirous only of policy tweaks. Many demonstrators held aloft signs saying, "Support the Communist Party, support socialism, and uphold the reforms." Moreover, senior members of the CPC, including Deng Xiaoping, broadly supported the protesters' demands for more transparency and less corruption. It was only after 1986 that pro-democracy voices came into the mix, as student protests erupted in Beijing, galvanized into action by Fang Lijie, an astrophysics professor returning from a teaching position in the US, and other intellectuals who advanced Western ideals as a remedy to Chinese socio-economic ills. The General Secretary at the time, Hu Yaobang, was later accused by the government of being soft on the protesters and was pressured to resign from his position in 1987. The reform-minded Hu eventually became a symbol of justice and freedom to the growing student protest movement, and when he died on April 15, 1989, crowds of protesters began to gather on Tiananmen Square to mourn his death. During this time, student organizers drafted a tentative list of demands, a list that would be revised and altered many times during the movement, insisting on increased press freedoms, more transparency, better pay, and fair coverage of the movement itself. The sit-in protests at Tiananmen were disorganized and scattered from the beginning. Certain elements were consistently equanimous, while others became increasingly militant due to the government's initial refusal to meet the movement halfway. It was during this time that certain hardliner student leaders began to emerge and take the reins. Foremost among them, Wu Erkai-shi, the charismatic leader of the Students' Association at Beijing Normal University, and Chai Ling, the mercurial commander-in-chief of the Students' Democracy Movement, who was one of the principal instigators of a major escalatory hunger strike that began on May 11th. It was during this time, as the movement was gaining widespread support, that US and UK intelligence agencies, as well as international media, began sowing the seeds of radicalism from without. In 1992, the Vancouver Sun ran an expose on CIA interference at Tiananmen using anonymous insider sources. In the article, it claims that the Central Intelligence Agency had sources among protesters, as well as within China's intelligence services, with which it enjoyed a close relationship since the 1970s, said the officials, who spoke this week on condition of anonymity. For months before the June 3rd attack on the demonstrators, the CIA had been helping student activists form the anti-government movement, providing typewriters, facsimile machines, and other equipment to help them spread their message, said one official. The report goes on to say that the CIA station chief in China left the country 2 days before Chinese troops attacked demonstrators in the capital Beijing in 1989, after predicting the military would not act. In 1975, James Lilly, a former CIA operative whose storied career had involved inserting CIA agents into China and undermining communist insurgencies in Laos, Japan and Taiwan, was appointed to the position of National Intelligence Officer for China, during which time he maintained close ties with George H.W. Bush, then Chief of the US Liaison Office in the People's Republic of China, and later US President. On May 8th of 1989, just as the protest movement was beginning to heat up, Bush appointed Lilly as US Ambassador to China, the only former CIA operative to have performed that function. During the build-up to the crackdown, Lilly housed Fang Li-jie and helped him flee to the US. George Soros, an American billionaire philanthropist, infamous for funding regime change operations in Eastern Europe, and with possible ties to the CIA, began making million-dollar endowments to his Fund for the Reform and Opening of China in the late 1980s, a fund with close ties to Zhao Ziyang's Institute for Economic Structural Reform. In 1988, the National Endowment for Democracy, a notorious CIA front organization, opened 2 offices in Beijing in order to hand out anti-CPC publications endorsing democratic values, and to set up seminars for student activists to discuss the idea of democracy in China. The NED offices closed down shortly after the events of June 4th. From the mid-1980s until June the 4th of 1989, Voice of America, a news outlet mouthpiece of the US government, provided shortwave radio broadcast coverage of the events in China, inciting the protesters to adopt more hardline attitudes towards the CPC, as well as providing strategic guidance and widespread encouragement. As the movement gained traction, VOA expanded its coverage of the events to around 80% of its Mandarin language broadcast, and increased its broadcasting time to around 11 hours per day. The media in general, for its part, played a negative role in the events, by emboldening the protesters beyond the point of conciliation. Mark Hertzgaard, writing for Rolling Stone magazine in 1989, said that the coverage presented a wildly optimistic picture of the protesters' chances of victory. For American television viewers, setting up these false expectations would prove disillusioning, but ultimately harmless. For the protesters, however, it may have been fatal. The American media's enthusiasm for the story may well have given the Chinese students a dangerously inflated sense of their own power, and of their immunity to the sort of vicious countermeasures that were eventually imposed. He goes on to say that the media-savvy students played to the cameras relentlessly. With signs and slogans in both English and French, the students clearly saw the International Press Corps as an ally. And television, through its magical ability to transport images across the globe and to tens of millions of TV sets simultaneously, helped create immense public sympathy for the protesters. This, in turn, altered the political landscape in which Chinese and American officials were operating. Bo Yibo, speaking during a Politburo meeting, allegedly said that the whole imperialist Western world wants to make socialist countries leave the socialist road and become satellites in the system of international monopoly capitalism. The people with ulterior motives who are behind this student movement have support from the United States and Europe and from the Kuomintang reactionaries in Taiwan. It was no accident that the student movement turned into turmoil. We mustn't underestimate the perils in this situation. The longer we delay, the worse it will get, and the harder it will be to extricate ourselves. The decisive measure of martial law will help to calm things down. Now, none of this is to suggest that the West is primarily to blame for the events in June of 1989. It isn't, as far as we know. The movement was a grassroots protest at its core, initiated by disgruntled workers and students, incensed at the corruption in their society. But there is enough evidence here and elsewhere to prove that the US, at the very least, was more than an idle bystander. The Vancouver Sun talks about CIA sources within the movement and about provisions of, quote, equipment, unquote. Molotov cocktails were used by the protesters, for example, a concoction never before seen or used in China, and a difficult weapon to produce given the strict rationing of petrol at the time. In 2006, MI6 admitted that Wang Yan, a person heavily involved in the movement, was a covert agent for the service during the protests. And from 1989 until 1997, MI6 and the CIA conducted a clandestine operation codenamed Yellowbird, during which they helped the most hardline student activists escape to the US and the UK, where they were offered generous scholarships for prestigious universities. It's fair to assume here that a clandestine operation to exfiltrate 400 student protesters through Hong Kong must have begun prior to the events of June 4th. Such an operation requires ample timing and money, after all, as well as close relations with the protesters. Quelling, for example, is known to have secretly held a US visa during the events at Tiananmen. The CIA were involved in organising on the ground, and plenty of money from Hong Kong, then a British colony, had helped to finance the movement prior to June 4th. It may never be known just how much the West influenced events at Tiananmen. However, it can be said that at the very least, the more hardline student protesters were encouraged by international media and by the CIA and MI6. Influences that helped to turn an equanimous movement, for which the CPC expressed sympathy and to which they were making tentative concessions, into a militant and unwieldy demand for outright democracy, something that the CPC, the ruling head of a one-party state, could never support. The protest had begun in mid-April, and by April 26, the movement had been branded anti-government in an editorial published by the People's Daily, the official mouthpiece of the Chinese government. According to the Tiananmen Papers, an alleged compilation of Politburo leaks published in the US, this sentiment appears to have been genuine, with senior members of government voicing serious concerns about the trajectory of the movement. In response, the Students' Union organised demonstrations, tens of thousands of protesters strong, through the streets of Beijing, managing to elicit widespread support from the locals and breaking through police lines. Around this time, the reform-minded Zhao Ziyang elected to meet with and negotiate with the student protesters. At this point, it's worth mentioning that despite the image we have in the West of an intransigent state refusing to meet any of the students' demands and resorting recklessly to violence, the Standing Committee were, in fact, fairly patient and placatory to begin with the government meeting with the students to negotiate on 3 separate occasions: on the 29th of April, on the 14th of May, and on the 19th of May. On the 29th of April, 45 students met with several government delegates for a series of dialogues. Most issues raised by the movement were discussed during the talks, and the government left the meeting happy. Many students rejected the process entirely and refused to attend, while others insisted on the creation of a student delegation to ensure equal representation. Nevertheless, progress was made, and tensions eased. The government began to grant tentative concessions, with Zhao Ziyang asking Hu Qili and Ray Xingwen, the two top state leaders in charge of China's official media, to loosen regulations. He told them that there was no big risk in opening up a bit by reporting the demonstrations and increasing the openness of news. A clear turning point, given that this concession addressed two of the movement's 7 major concerns. By early May, many students were discussing returning to class, and interest in the movement in general was waning. By this time, there were clear divisions within the movement, with certain hardliners pushing for more confrontational methods, whilst other groups were advocating for continuing as normal or else giving up entirely. On May 13, around 300 student activists initiated a hunger strike, galvanized into action by Chai Ling in an emotional appeal the night before. Members of the Beijing Students' Autonomous Union tried to stop it and insisted that it was too much of a reckless affront to the state. This would prove prophetic. The strike was mobilized at Tiananmen Square and would glue the movement steadfastly to the scene in a move that lasted far longer than many of the protesters had initially thought. On May 14th, the government and students met again. Yan Mingfu, representing the state, and Shen Tong and Xiang Xiaoji, representing the movement, discussed the 26th of April editorial, demands for democracy, and the eventual withdrawal of the protesters. Unfortunately, the student delegates' demands were often contradictory and incoherent, owing to the increasing fragmentation and turmoil within the movement. Yan tried his best to placate the movement, even offering himself as a hostage in order to prove good faith. But it was all in vain. The meetings fell apart after the delegates realized that their meetings were not being broadcast live as was promised. It was during this time that an historical moment for the CPC was taking place. Mikhail Gorbachev was visiting the country, an important precedent given the cool relations between China and the USSR at the time. The government had hoped to get the students out of the square before the visit, but had failed during the negotiations. On May 13th, Wu Kaishi and Wang Dan had convinced the movement to withdraw by May 15th, owing to Yan Mingfu's seeming sincerity in a speech delivered to the students that day. Chai Ling and her husband Feng Zongde, however, had vetoed this decision and had insisted on staying put no matter what. On May 14th, 12 intellectuals, those who had engaged in the dialogues that day, went to the square in order to encourage the students to withdraw in order to let the Sino-Soviet summit go ahead without issue. And while the appeals were well received generally, certain hardliners rejected them and insisted that the intellectuals were there to help the government. At that point, Feng Zongde, upon Chai Ling's suggestion, reread the hunger strike declaration over the broadcasting station, rallying the students who became hostile to the intellectuals, the same people who had originally sparked the movement and who had been sympathetic to their cause. The hunger strike continued throughout the visit, a huge embarrassment to the CPC, no doubt, and another crucial turning point in the timeline. Rivaling factions within the movement were losing influence at this point, and the hunger strike leaders, the most militant activists within the movement, were gaining the dominant position. By May 17th, the movement had garnered widespread sympathy and support from locals. The number of hunger strikers had increased dramatically, and neither the government nor the protesters had made much headway for their side. It was around this time that the Central Secretariat began discussing martial law. On May 17th at his home, Deng Xiaoping said, "After thinking long and hard about this, I've concluded that we should bring in the People's Liberation Army and declare martial law in Beijing. more precisely in Beijing's urban districts. The government had already set up 2 formal dialogues and a series of informal talks. They had been providing crucial aid to striking students and were under immense pressure to stem the tide of a deeply disruptive movement. The Tiananmen papers seemed to suggest that their anxieties were genuine and that their patience was at its end. On May 18th, Li Peng, the Premier of China, met with the student delegates, a meeting which was broadcast live on television as was promised. Li Peng opened the dialogue by expressing concern for the hunger strikers, insisting that it was a point of priority for the standing committee. Kai-shi interrupted Li to say that the movement was not concerned with that at present, and that the delegates wanted only to talk about more substantive issues. The dialogue was heated throughout, and yielded little of substance. By this point, many student activists were openly calling for regime change, incensed at Li's hardline stance against the movement. In spite of having given in to their demands for live broadcast and for dialogue. During the meeting, an exasperated Li reportedly said that Beijing in the last few days has basically fallen into a state of anarchy. We, the government, cannot sit by and idly watch. We must protect our factories, the achievements of socialism and our capital. In the early morning of May 19th, the pro-reformer Zhao Ziyang met with the students one last time, before resigning from the committee ranks, perhaps because of pressure from more hardline members of the Politburo, primarily Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping. Hu Qili and Hu Yaobang had been ousted too for similar reasons. One, for being overly and suspiciously idealistic about the movement, and 2, for being inept at managing student expectations. Zhao Ziyang's concessive style failed to quell the protests, and so the party deemed it necessary to take a more hardline approach. Despite what's commonly assumed, the purging of moderate or reformist party members did not precipitate the crackdown at Tiananmen. It wasn't so much a putsch by perennial hardliners like Li Peng, as it was a governmental shift from concessive to militant over time. As Dingxin Zhao writes, the state tried every control measure in its repertoire, to no avail. In the end, the state leaders were left with only 2 choices, either to repress the students or to face the prospect of eventually stepping down, as the communist leaders in Eastern European countries had done. However, since most top leaders in China during the late 1980s had joined the revolution long before the communists took power, it was almost impossible for them, reformers and hardliners alike, to give up the power for which millions of their revolutionary comrades had died. Thus, military repression became their only choice. The government's back-and-forth approach had less to do with internal factionalism and more to do with being blindsided, presumably. The government's concessive approach to the movement had begun without Zhao Ziyang on the 27th of April, whilst he had been in North Korea. And on May 18th, Li Peng himself initiated a dialogue, the day after the Secretariat began discussing martial law. By now, the students were aware of the impending order to begin martial law. Zhang Bo-li convened a headquarters meeting in order to end the hunger strike, so as not to give the government an excuse to declare martial law. Most of the strike leaders agreed, but many students accused the leaders of selling out. Eventually, Feng Zongde spoke out against the others, insisting that the decision was invalid. A bitter fight broke out between the competing factions, during which Li Lu and Wang Wen physically fought and Feng Zongde resigned from the student headquarters. Nevertheless, Zhang Bo-li announced publicly that the hunger strikes had ended. At 10 p.m. on May 19th, the government declared martial law. PLA troops flooded into Beijing, but were stopped by sympathetic locals and by protesters. The atmosphere was calmer than might have been expected, and many soldiers and students engaged in talks. the troops would withdraw from the area on May 24th, after failing to break through the throngs of activists blocking their way. The hunger strike leaders went into hiding, fearful of violent reprisals, and in the interim, new organisations made up of new student arrivals began to gain influence. Between May 16th and May 26th, around 172,000 outside students arrived at Beijing by train, while only 86,000 left. This influx further confused the direction of the movement. On May 22nd, Wang Chaohua, leader of the revitalized Beijing Students' Autonomous Union, collected signatures from over 200 university representatives who agreed that it was time to leave the square. The hunger strikers returned that day, after realizing that troops were not going to attack the square, as was initially thought, despite them having arrived from all directions in Beijing on May 20th. Zhang Boli tricked Wang into giving the signature sheet to him, and then refused to return it, and Chai Ling chastised Wang and the Beijing Students' Autonomous Union for being ineffectual. Over the coming days, Wu Kaishi would be expelled from his leadership position. Wang Chaohua would be asked to leave the square, and Lian Chengde of the Federation of Students from outside Beijing would also be dismissed from her position on June 1st, all for suggesting that the students should finally withdraw. Between May 23rd and the beginning of June, the movement began to wind down. The number of overnight activists dropped from around 100,000, 200,000 to around 10,000 by the end of May. 90% of the students came from outside Beijing. Meanwhile, more radical students were doing their best to maintain momentum. On May 29th, art students from the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing unveiled the Goddess of Democracy, a 30-foot papier-mâché sculpture of a woman raising a torch in both hands. The model was not in fact modelled after the Statue of Liberty, as was another in Shanghai, unveiled 2 days earlier, for fear of seeming too openly pro-American. People flocked to see the sculpture, and by May 30th, the square had become temporarily congested again. On June 2nd, Liu Xiaobo and 3 other intellectuals initiated a new hunger strike. Liu was concerned about the trajectory of the movement and had organised the strike in order to rally students and take control. The hunger strike effectively ended 2 days later, during the crackdown, but the stunt had won the intellectuals the respect of the students once more, something that may well have helped them to broker a settlement on June 4th, which we will get to shortly. What really happened on the 3rd and 4th of June in 1989? Was it the cold-blooded massacre of innocents, the way the Western media describes it? Or was it all a hoax? How accurately does the Western world's outrage square with the facts? Let's take a look. Between the 22nd of May and the 24th of May, the Beijing Red Cross sent 3 different groups to the square in order to assist protesters and to encourage them to withdraw. Between the 23rd and the 27th of May, the government sent various officials to the square to try and persuade the student representatives to urge the others to leave. But it was an impossible task. Hardliners within the movement were shutting down any discussion of withdrawal. In a lengthy report from the Beijing Municipal Party Committee entitled On the True Nature of the Turmoil, published on June the 1st, the movement was branded a counter-revolutionary riot. The report provides evidence of anti-government sentiment, such as a poster at Beijing Normal University stating that the square has become like a great banner for democratic patriotism, the epicenter and heart of the national movement for democracy, and that the students must not withdraw. Another poster said that the students should streamline the student ranks in Tiananmen Square and tighten up their organisation to make their command structure more efficient and their actions more deft. The report stresses, in the words of the students, that the movement was willing to take strong responses and to use the square to form an anti-government united front against the state if necessary. It goes on to say that a tiny minority within the movement was using the square as their base for provoking conflicts, exacerbating tensions, and trying to cause bloodshed in order to make a national and even international impact. They believe that if we refuse to withdraw, the government will crack down, and that fresh blood will wake up the people and lead to a split and collapse of the government. This last point is backed up by none other than Quelling herself, one of the most radical student leaders within the movement, a leader whose recalcitrant and incorrigible stance against the state had stymied settlement. Here she is speaking to American journalist Philip Cunningham on the 2nd of June, 2 days before the crackdown.
The students keep asking, what should we do next? What can we accomplish? I feel so sad. Because how can I tell them that what we are actually hoping for is bloodshed? For the moment when the government has no choice but to brazenly butcher the people. Only when the square is awash with blood will the people of China open their eyes. Only then will they really be united. But how can I explain any of this to my fellow students? And what is truly sad is that some students and some famous, well-connected people are working hard to help the government, to prevent it from taking such measures. For the sake of their selfish interests and their private dealings, they are trying to cause our movement to collapse and get us out of the square before the government becomes so desperate that it takes action.
For some, the movement had become about taking on the government, no longer about issues of transparency and corruption, but about overthrowing the state by any means necessary. The report discusses the role of external influences, touched on earlier in this video. The Voice of America, it says, has played an extremely inglorious role, only adding fuel to the flames. Every day it airs 3 programs, totaling 10 hours or more, manufacturing rumours and inciting turmoil. Newspapers in the United States, Hong Kong and Taiwan pile up report after report filled with distortions. It talks about CIA interference and about the US's role in radicalizing students through various means, including the opening of training and exchange centers within China, exchange programs abroad, and funding and dissemination of anti-CPC propaganda. It further discusses interference from Taiwan and reports on having apprehended several KMT spies formerly interacting with students. On the morning of June 2nd, Deng Xiaoping, Li Xiannian, Peng Zhen, Yang Shangkun, Bo Yibo, Wang Zhen and Li Peng convened for a final meeting on how to resolve the crisis, during which they agreed to issue the order for redeployment of troops to forcefully clear the square. Li Peng and Wang Zhen were the most militant members present, with Wang at one point crying out, "Those goddamn bastards, who do they think they are, trampling on sacred ground like Tiananmen so long? They are really asking for it." And he finished by saying that anyone who tries to overthrow the Communist Party deserves death and no burial. Now, while these words can give us a sense of his state of mind at the time, they aren't any kind of prescription, and the council as a whole took a more outwardly rational approach to the topic. Deng Xiaoping, referring to what the state would do to the protesters in the days following the clearing of the square, stated that we can't blame the people who joined the hunger strike, demonstrated or petitioned. We should target only those who had bad intentions, or who took the lead in breaking the law. Education should be our main approach to the students, including the students who join the hunger strike. This principle must not change. We should set the majority of the students free from worry. We should be forgiving toward all the students who join the marches, demonstrations or petitions, and not hold them responsible. We will mete out precise and necessary punishments only to the minority of adventurers who attempted to subvert the People's Republic of China. Hardly the words of a man who expects these same people to be shot dead in the coming hours. Yang Shangkun offered that all troops have initiated civilian-military cooperation work, and this has improved their rapport with the masses from all stations in society, and has given them a good social image. For these reasons, I am fully confident that we can clear the square in a peaceful way. Peng Zhen opined that, I think the students will withdraw once we've given them a clear explanation. And that's because the clearing isn't aimed at any individual student. It's only to restore the square to its original condition and to restore normal social life and order in Beijing. The most bloodthirsty voice was Wang's, no doubt, and everyone present was certainly angry. In spite of this though, the decision to kill students on the square, or indeed to kill anyone anywhere, was never reached. You could say that there was an implicit understanding. After all, the military is an organ of the state with only one function. And I would tentatively agree. Not that the council were tacitly calling for blood, because all we have is their word and there's no evidence for that, but because the act of deploying the military was a dangerous provocation in and of itself, and a moral crime. The meeting ended with an ominous coda from Deng, the closest the Secretariat comes to acknowledging the potential for bloodshed. As we proceed with the clearing, he said, we must explain it clearly to all the citizens and students, asking them to leave and doing our very best to persuade them. But if they refuse to leave, they will be responsible for the consequences. Plainclothes soldiers had been slowly infiltrating the square since May 26. By the beginning of June, students and locals had become alert to the military presence. A major turning point came in the afternoon of June 2nd, when a military jeep being operated by CCTV television crew ran over and killed 3 civilians, apparently accidentally. The signal went out to the throngs of protesters blocking the way to the square that the government had started their attack, owing to the fact that it was a military vehicle that had killed the civilians. The protesters began setting up roadblocks at major intersections and began verbally and physically attacking troops. A Tsinghua student recalled that the locals cast bricks at soldiers and pulled them out to beat them. At that time, the soldiers did not fight back. According to Dingxin Zhao, citing PLA testimonies, many soldiers were beaten up between the evening of June 2nd and the night of June 3rd. Troops began to infiltrate the area more conspicuously late June 2nd, where they came into conflict with increasingly hostile locals, who began lecturing, spitting on, and kicking the soldiers. Many nonplussed soldiers were rounded up by the protesters and then encircled and hectored. He notes that because most people, including journalists, were against martial law, civilian brutalities, and especially those that happened before the military repression, have generally been ignored. Protesters around this time also began finding and confiscating weapons that had been sent into the area for plainclothes troops to pick up. Philip Cunningham described the scene at West Chang'an Boulevard. The wide street was full of traffic, but choked up with the carcasses of 3 smashed buses and shards of broken brick and glass. We stepped out of the car cautiously, not sure the bricks had stopped flying. The tension in the air was almost visible, like heat hovering over a hot road. The buses reminded me of beetles attacked and stripped of meat by an army of ants. The interiors had been picked clean by the mob, upholstered seats ripped apart, metal bars bent out of shape. This was no ordinary case of looting, but an expression of hatred to the fingertips, hatred to the bone. Why the anger? The sacking of a bus? I asked around and was told the story of a Trojan horse. The bus had been full of lethal weapons, ammunition, and other military supplies. There has been a suggestion that the government sent weapons into the hands of protesters on purpose in order to create a pretext for repression. But there's no evidence for this, and the Secretariat never discussed anything of the kind. The plainclothes troops needed weapons, and smuggling them in on buses was the only way of procuring them. The martial law headquarters sent out riot police in order to retrieve the lost weapons. Several clashes broke out as a result, with the riot police using batons and tear gas. These acts intensified the hostilities on both sides. Throughout June the 3rd, army vehicles were blocked or overturned by protesters. Tires were punctured, and approximately 500 soldiers were surrounded in pockets. The PLA were initially reticent to cause trouble and forced their way through civilian ranks. Philip Cunningham notes, "As far as I could observe, the PLA had not yet been willing to breach, let alone smash and ride over, the patently flimsy barricades scattered around the downtown area. The only serious barrier keeping the troops from the sacred grounds of Tiananmen Square was human flesh, the fear of confronting fellow citizens." For 24 hours the PLA did nothing in response to protester violence. As ABC News notes, the first shots fired were heard on June the 3rd at around 10 p.m. It was around that time that the final order had been given to begin clearing the square. The available evidence seems to suggest that the shooting began only in response to protester violence. General Zhang, the Deputy Commissioner of Troops entering from the south, said that he was given strict orders not to use live ammunition, while Zhao Xiaochang, another commissioner also leading a group from the south, insisted that ammunition was given, but they had been ordered to use it only to fire into the air to disperse crowds. There was seemingly no consensus on the use of live ammunition, and different regiments had different approaches. Many soldiers carried unloaded rifles, and some commanders gave out ammunition only to trusted officers. What this suggests again is that there was no massacre planned that night, nor was killing in any way programmatic. Most of the shooting occurred in the west, between the intersections at Liubukou and Mushidi. Dingxin Zhao suggests this is because the resistance here was the most violent. Reportedly, the 38th Army, positioned in the west, had 6 deaths, 159 critical injuries, over 1,100 other injuries, and about 3,000 beaten up. It also lost 47 armoured vehicles and 65 trucks, most of them burnt by street fighters. By late June 3rd, the situation had turned into a frenzy. In the early evening, the government had issued circulars around Beijing stressing that all citizens and students in Tiananmen Square should leave immediately to ensure that the martial law troops carry out their tasks, and those who do not heed the advice will not be able to guarantee their safety, and they will be completely responsible for all the consequences. And again, at around 10 p.m, another stern warning was issued, saying that the current situation in Beijing is very serious. From now on, please do not go to the streets to avoid unnecessary losses. In spite of this, the army was met with stiff resistance at various points along Chang'an Avenue, at Wukersong, Gongjufen, Mushidi, Fuxingmen, and at Xidan. The protesters undoubtedly initiate the struggle by refusing to capitulate and by hectoring, throwing bricks, kicking, and spitting at the soldiers. However, the PLA undeniably and inexcusably escalated the situation by firing back at them. The PLA and the protesters both deserve blame. Fierce resistance only came from certain hardliner groups, while other protesters remained calm and even fed and sat with soldiers, who responded in kind. Philip Cunningham relayed that certain workers within the movement, situated on the square, had vowed to defend the students until the end. According to Wu Renhua, the first protester killed by gunfire was Song Xiaoming, a factory worker, at around 10 p.m, and the first soldier who died was at around 1 a.m. This should hardly be surprising given the difference in firepower. Nevertheless, the protesters showed themselves to be incredibly violent, given the circumstances. Wu Renhua, an active participant in the protests, has suggested that otherwise peaceful protesters reacted violently only in response to the shooting. But this doesn't ring true. The lengths the protesters went to fend off the encroachment of the PLA suggests that the protesters had at the very least planned for that outcome. Cunningham describes seeing protesters, not students, on the square brandishing Molotov cocktails. He writes that there were warriors with agendas unknown pressing in on us. No overt hostility was directed at his film crew per se, but the anger and seething lust for violence was palpable. The Washington Post at the time reported that there were protesters stoning troops, beating them with poles, and in some particularly dramatic photos, firebombing trucks, buses, and even armoured personnel carriers. In some cases, soldiers were still inside at the time. On one avenue in western Beijing, demonstrators torched an entire military convoy of more than 100 trucks and armoured vehicles. Aerial pictures of the conflagration and columns of smoke have powerfully bolstered the government's argument that the troops were victims, not executioners. Other scenes show soldiers' corpses and demonstrators stripping automatic rifles off of unresisting soldiers. Jeff Widener, the photojournalist behind the infamous Tankman picture, taken on June 5th, wrote about the carnage on Chang'an Avenue. He described seeing an APC that was completely engulfed in flames, lurching and sputtering towards me. Protesters had shoved steel objects in the treads to slow it down, and the soldiers were roasting alive inside. Philip Cunningham described seeing a Molotov cocktail being thrown at APC, causing it to ignite, and writes further that the protesters showed no mercy at the thought of soldiers being caught inside. The agitated congregation was in no mood for mercy, he writes. Angry, blood-curdling voices ricocheted around us. "Kill the motherfucker," one said. Then another voice, even more chilling than the first, screamed, "He is not human, he is a thing." Kill it, shouted bystanders. Bloody enthusiasm now whipped up to a high pitch. He noted somberly that the students had lost control. The crowd had started cracking, and the movement was breaking up into splintered mobs. There were calls for cooperation and shouts for vengeance. The bloodthirst made me nauseous. Internal documents published in the Tiananmen papers describe other acts of protester violence. This passage, for example, which states that rioters beat a platoon leader to death and then hung his body from a burning bus, disemboweled him, and gouged his eyes out. Another which states that more than 500 army trucks were torched at dozens of intersections. Protesters surrounded more than 70 armoured trucks, stripping 23 of them of their machine guns. On Chang'an Boulevard, an army truck's engine was turned off, and 200 rioters stormed the cab and beat the driver to death. On the Chongwen-men overpass, rioters flung a soldier over the side, then doused him with gasoline and set him on fire, and then suspended the body from the overpass. Rioters have savagely attacked soldiers of the PLA, have stolen their weapons and burned their vehicles, have erected roadblocks, and have kidnapped officers and soldiers. Rioters flung burning objects into a truck, exploding its gas tank. all 6 soldiers inside burnt to death. Louisa Lim, in her book on Tiananmen, describes how in the early morning hours of June 4th, a 25-year-old soldier named Liu Guogeng was murdered by a mob near to where the guns were taken. The image of his dead body became iconic in the state-run Chinese media, since it illustrated the real dangers faced by the martial law troops. Liu's burned corpse had been suspended by the neck from a blackened public bus, naked but for his socks, an army hat incongruously perched on his head. The soldier had reportedly been killed for shooting unarmed civilians. Zhang Shijun, a PLA medic at the time and whistleblower, describes rocks and bricks being thrown at him and his comrades, and even bullets being fired at them by unknown shooters. Nicholas Christoph wrote that 2 groups of young people commandeered city buses to attack the troops. About 10 people were in each bus, and they held firebombs or sticks in their hands as they drove toward lines of armoured personnel carriers and troops. He went on to say that the violence on both sides seemed to mark a milestone in the democracy movement, and the streets in the centre of the city were a kaleidoscope of scenes rarely, if ever, seen in the Chinese capital. Furious crowds smashed and overturned army vehicles in front of Zhongnan High, and then stoned the Great Hall of the People. Grim-faced young soldiers clutching submachine guns tried to push their way through thick crowds of demonstrators near the Beijing train station, and the police charged the crowd near Zhongnan High and used truncheons to beat men and women disabled by tear gas. A tragic frenzy, a paroxysm of violence, needlessly erupting on the streets of central Beijing. There were widespread reports of protesters attacking ambulances, lynching soldiers, and setting fires. The soldiers, for their part, were even worse, forgetting near instantly their civilian-military relations training and firing indiscriminately at crowds until around 4 a.m. in the morning of June 4th, as they coalesced on Tiananmen Square. Dingxin Zhao writes that the fact that a few soldiers might have been out of control could be seen from how civilians were shot during the repression. Of the 92 victims listed by Ding, 24% of them, were injured while in unquestionably passive positions. Some people were shot while just taking pictures or hiding behind something. Wu Renhua has extensively recorded the tragic events of that night, listing numerous deaths at the hands of the PLA, including the shooting of a 9-year-old student and his mother at Fuxingmen Overpass in the west. Duan Changlong, a student from Tsinghua University, shot and killed with a pistol during a confrontation with an officer, and Wu Guofeng, a student at Chinese Min University, shot 3 times and stabbed with a bayonet on West Chang'an Avenue. By 1 a.m. on the morning of June 4th, all martial law troops had managed to close in on Tiananmen Square from all sides, at which point loudspeakers began to blare out an announcement calling on the protesters to evacuate the square. By 2 a.m, tens of thousands of students had withdrawn, dwindling the number of remaining students to only a few thousand. Around that time, a dozen students and citizens carrying cans of gasoline tried to torch the army trucks parked at the north of the square, but the soldiers took them into custody, according to a report from the State Security Ministry. At 3 a.m, Hou Dejian, Liu Xiaobo, Zhou Duo, and Gao Xin, intellectuals present at the time, decided to urge the students to evacuate the square peacefully. Chai Ling, true to form, attempted to subvert calls for evacuation by insisting that those who wish to leave may leave, and those who don't may stay. At 3:45 a.m, Ho, speaking to a regimental commissar on behalf of the students, said that we volunteer to take all of the students out of the square and asked the PLA not to open fire. Please give us enough time to organise an evacuation. The commissar, after several minutes, agreed, stating that the command post accepts your request. Take the students out of the square immediately, exiting to the south. You don't have much time. We won't open fire. At 4 a.m, the lights at Tiananmen went out as scheduled, but came back on at around 4:30. During the blackout, troops had converged on the students. At 5 a.m, most of the remaining students retreated towards the southeast corner of the square, shouting "repressive bloodbath, down with fascism," as they withdrew. By 5:20, the remaining defiant few had been hemmed in by tanks on all sides. They slowly retreated out of the square, shouting insults as they went. The PLA reportedly shout back in unison, "If no one attacks me, I attack no one." By 5:40 a.m, the square had been completely cleared. J. Matthews, Washington Post Beijing bureau chief in 1989, and on the scene at the time, said of the incident that as far as can be determined from the available evidence, no one died that night in Tiananmen Square. CBS News reporter Richard Roth wrote later that we saw no bodies, injured people, ambulances or medical personnel. In short, nothing to even suggest, let alone prove, that a massacre had occurred in Tiananmen Square. BBC foreign correspondent James Miles was unequivocal in stating that he was one of the foreign journalists who witnessed the events that night. There was no massacre on Tiananmen Square. These accounts are corroborated by most journalists and by the CPC itself. The only people who disagree with this version of events are some of the student leaders themselves. Chai Ling reckoned she saw scores of students violently gunned down on the square, and Wu Kai-shi said he saw over 200 students shot in cold blood. This despite the fact that he wasn't even on the square when the events he describes took place. Over the past couple of decades, from the late 1990s onwards, the media class have slowly shifted the goalposts. Initially, the media zealously and misleadingly reported on the incident, calling it a massacre, and journalists who had been on the scene quietly accepted the prevailing narrative. Over time, those same journalists have come forward and said, well look, there was no massacre of peaceful students on the square per se, but the act of killing protesters beyond the bounds of the square was just as heinous. The tenor of condemnation has remained constant, despite the extenuating revelations that have come to light since the event. And in very recent years, the condemnation has intensified, despite the incident having taken place over 30 years ago, and despite the fact that the 8 immortals who made the decision to declare martial law are now all dead. Being ordered to kill tens of thousands of protesters peacefully protesting on a vast open square, as per the standard misconception of the events, is far, far more heinous than being ordered to clear the square and reacting violently to stiff and vicious resistance. The Secretariat never decided, at least explicitly, to kill anyone. Soldiers were initially reticent about confronting protesters, and many soldiers defied orders and refused to implement martial law. The very act of declaring martial law was in itself deplorable, and the frenzy that inevitably followed, as tempers reached a fever pitch late on June 3rd, could have been avoided. Nevertheless, the ruthless motives attributed to the CPC and the continual hand-wringing by the West are sensationalist. And one can't help but get a sense that the media class relish being able to castigate the Chinese state. It was a highly pressurized series of events. The government were at their wits' end by the end of May, having tried to engage with the movement. To their minds, by early June, it had become a choice between either regime change or repression. The student representatives were unsure of themselves, and made up for that by increasing the level of militancy. By the end, hardliners hoping for a direct confrontation with the state had effectively sidelined the more moderate voices within the movement. For 3 hours, beginning late June the 3rd, fighting, rioting, gunfire and conflagration shook the conscience of the state. Most of the students held fast to the principle of non-violence, relinquishing PLA confiscated weapons and remaining on the square. However, their actions leading up to June 4th had created an environment of lawlessness in central Beijing, an environment exploited by thugs and opportunists. The movement didn't have the mandate of heaven on its side, nor was it justified in rioting. As Philip Cunningham writes, while the ringleaders at Tiananmen had no serious democratic claim to speak for the people, or to lead the people, they did effectively question the government's lack of democratic authority to do the same. It was more of a power play within a communist society than anything recognizably democratic. Only 1 in 4 Chinese people lived in the cities at the time, and most likely rural communities in China had no idea or cared much about the events going on in Beijing and elsewhere. In 2017, the BBC published an article about a secret cable from former British ambassador Alan Donald, in which he stated that a close friend of his within China's State Council told him personally that the death toll was no less than 10,000 civilians. 10,000 in around 3 hours. That doesn't really make any sense. That amounts to around 55 people a minute, almost 1 death a second, consistently for 3 hours, all within a 20 square kilometre radius. Given that various journalists and diplomats described the shooting on the night of June the 3rd as sporadic, it can't really be possible, even if there were 300,000 troops on the ground, which is the high estimate. Early reports suggested that the Chinese Red Cross had estimated that between 2,600 to 3,400 civilians had been killed. However, this turns out to have been an offshoot of a rumour circulated by a Japanese official who was conflating figures of missing protesters. The Chinese Red Cross denied ever having come up with any such figures. On June 6th, Li Peng referenced the Chinese Red Cross in a preliminary report on the number of deaths, citing their figure as 218 dead civilians and 23 dead soldiers. White House Chief of Staff John Sununu said in a television interview broadcast on June 11th that the best number of those killed in Beijing measures in the thousands and could be even higher than 4,000. What he was basing this figure on is unclear, because a declassified US National Security Agency cable from June the 4th, 1989, states that the figure ranges from 180 to 500, and Ambassador James Lilly estimated that several hundred had been killed, based off of various visits to hospitals in the surrounding area. Another recently declassified US cable gave an estimate of 500 to 2,600, the upper bound figure matching the ostensible Red Cross figure mentioned before. New York Times reporter Nicholas Kristof, in Beijing during the crackdown, and who later won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting of the events, wrote that, based on the evidence that is now available, it seems plausible that about a dozen soldiers and policemen were killed, along with 400 to 800 civilians. These figures seem reasonable, but if we look at his report, we can see that even here, the upper bound has been generously extrapolated. For instance, he takes fatality figures from 8 major hospitals in the surrounding area, several hours after the crackdown, for a sum total of 184. He rounds this figure up to 200 to allow for the critically wounded at the hospitals who may have died later, which is fair enough. He then states that 12 other hospitals in the wider area had significant but somewhat lower casualties, according to one medical official, and then supposes that, with a 10-person casualty average per hospital, 120 might have died. The term significant is subjective, and given that the figure from the 8 hospitals averages at 23 deaths per hospital, the per hospital rate for the 12 hospitals could be as low as 2 deaths each and still be considered significant. Not to mention that Christoph is extrapolating a considerable sum based off of the uncorroborated assertions of one official. The same official, Christoph writes, asserted that there were scattered deaths at 20 other hospitals. Again, this imprecise description could plausibly mean that only a handful of deaths were reported in the area containing those hospitals, or that every hospital had several deaths. Christoph leans towards the latter reading and plumps for an additional 40 fatalities. He then suggests that an additional 140 people may have died on the streets and not gone to hospital. Possible, but purely speculative. Most people caught in the line of fire and critically injured were carried away to hospitals by fellow activists and friends. To bolster this line of thought, Christoph asserts that the PLA may have burnt bodies on the square to hide evidence of the killings, as large plumes of smoke from a bonfire were seen immediately following the crackdown. He concedes that it may have been the tents and other remnants of the students' encampment on the square, but that some fear it was also used to cremate the students' bodies. Again, eminently plausible, but entirely speculative. The lower bound of 400 deaths in Christoph's report is reasonable in any case, and more in line with the government's own tally. In 1992, Timothy Brook, a Canadian historian who specialises in the study of China, estimated, using a similar method to Christoph of collecting hospital records, that at least 478 civilians died between June the 3rd and 4th. He laments in his book that pursuing numbers that are not available is a fruitless task. Our best estimates are wild guesses. Conclusive evidence eludes us. He nevertheless stresses that 478 deaths is the bare minimum, and that the true toll is probably higher. Tiananmen Mothers, an advocacy group founded by Dingxin and Zhang Xianling, whose children were murdered on June the 4th, have identified 202 victims killed during the crackdown. Every year the group pens a letter to the CPC, calling on them to acknowledge and atone for the event. The letter last year was signed by 122 mothers and included another 162 signatures from deceased former members. Human Rights Watch put the death toll figure at 2,000 in a report from 2009. As with the Samunu figure, it's difficult to discern where exactly this figure comes from. It's possible that it's simply a mean figure, including high-end estimates. Amnesty International put the figure at 1,000 deaths. How many soldiers died? According to a preliminary report from the martial law headquarters, there were 23 martial law troop casualties, including 10 from the PLA and 13 from the People's Armed Police. 200 soldiers were reported missing. As Timothy Brook writes, if statistics regarding civilian casualties are hard to come by, information about military casualties is even more hidden. Wu Renhua, in his report, could only verify 15 soldier fatalities, and of these, only half were deaths directly caused by protesters. However, we have first-hand testimonies from Jeff Widener, Nicholas Christoph, Jay Matthews, Philip Cunningham, Cindy Strand, and others, stating that multiple APCs were set on fire and that soldiers roasted alive inside.
Bullets would fly past us and you'd hear people crying and screaming, and this APC was on fire, and I think many soldiers died in that APC that night.
And yet, according to Ru Wenhua, of the casualties he managed to independently verify, none of them died from thermal injuries. Wu concedes in his report that unless the government makes the information publicly available, the exact toll may never be known. Timothy Brook notes that, as much as possible, the army tried to get its casualties to PLA hospitals, of which there were many in and around the city, so as to mask casualties. According to Yuan Mu, soldiers suffered over 5,000 injuries, a figure which makes for a stark injury-to-death ratio when compared with the standard rate for conflict. Given this, and given the many first-hand reports that testify to seeing many protester brutalities, it may well be that the government purposefully kept the figure low in order to not make the PLA troops look ineffectual, given the volatile climate at the time, but large enough to vilify the movement. So there we have it. Interestingly, minutes from the Secretariat meetings on June the 6th seem to suggest that the Secretariat members were indignant at the exaggerated death toll figures published in the West. Bo read aloud headlines from the Associated Press, NBC, ABC, and the BBC. Reports from all the big Western news services and TV networks about the so-called June 4th bloodbath at Tiananmen, he said. Peng Zhen added that all kinds of rumours are running wild these days. We need to set things straight and fast. On how many died, for example, the number has gone from thousands to tens of thousands, and people like VOA are making up new rumours every day. Now, it could be the case that the Secretariat weren't equipped with all the facts by June 6, or that the meetings were dominated by artifice. Not unimaginable. Nevertheless, the Secretariat were commenting on an irrefutable phenomenon of the event, the tendency of the media to exaggerate and sensationalise on the tragedy of it all, then and now. It seems reasonable, based on the available tallies, that around 400 to 600 people were tragically killed around June the 4th. Many commentators, Brook, Zhao, Christoph, have suggested that there are likely many more deaths than have been accounted for. But this assertion is based purely on the fact that the Chinese government haven't been forthcoming about publishing figures or launching an inquiry, much like the US in the case of Panama. But there's no reason to assume that a wealth of information lies behind Chinese censors. Journalists, academics, and advocacy groups have tirelessly tried to piece together the truth of June the 4th, and none have come anywhere close to a death toll figure of several thousand. In the days following the crackdown, activist Liu Xiaobo said that Tiananmen Square has almost become a rumour centre, regardless of sources and authenticity. Anybody can bring in a story and broadcast it through the Student Broadcasting Centre. The more sensational the news, the higher its value. If things go on like this, what is the difference between our news and communist propaganda? The rumours have persisted, and Tiananmen has become an event immortalised like no other. Here are the facts. Bear these in mind as we move on to part 2 of this video series, looking at the US invasion of Panama. In mid-April, a protest movement, one without clear direction, rapidly gathered speed in Beijing and across the country. The ruling party tried a concessive style initially in order to quell the movement. By May, hardliners on both sides were losing patience. A hunger strike was initiated by students, garnering mass amounts of sympathy from locals and escalating the crisis. Martial law was declared in order to show the protesters that the state meant business, though the soldiers did nothing. Further rounds of dialogue were initiated, but came to nothing. The ruling party, extremely threatened and under pressure to stem the tide of a movement once and for all, redeployed troops at the end of May. On June 3rd, troops began to break through protester lines to reach the square. They were met with violent resistance, though the blame for killing civilians, of course, lies solely with them. The frenzy lasted for several hours, during which hundreds of people were tragically killed. There are various reasons why this event was pulled inexorably into the cultural slipstream, and the invasion of Panama wasn't. Something we will cover in part 3. For now, let's just go back to the quote from Noam Chomsky, who said that a propaganda system will consistently portray people abused in enemy states as worthy victims, whereas those treated with equal or greater severity by its own government or clients will be unworthy. The evidence of worth may be read from the extent and character of attention and indignation. Tiananmen was an event worthy of condemnation. Sadly, one among many the world over. But only a vague understanding of it might leave you with the sense that the scale and barbarity of it are unrivaled in human history. But as part 2 will hopefully show, this is simply untrue. Thanks for watching.